In this video, I'll be going over how to adapt the basic model of the battery-operated plush toy. So first, I'm going to be going over the list of materials you're going to be needing for adapting the basic battery-operated plush toy. Then after that, I'm going to adapt the plush toy step by step from start to finish. So with that being said, let's get started with the materials. I'll just briefly list each of them and their function. So I sort of ordered them chronologically from top left to bottom right. So first is a ruler. Next is a 6 foot, 3.5 millimeter stereo extension cable, male to female. You're gonna need wire cutters, wire strippers, a seam ripper, a helping hands kit. You're gonna need soldering equipment, so soldering iron and solder. And then you're going to be needing some electrical tape and a sewing kit, so just simply a thread and needle. So now that we went over the list of materials, we're going to be starting with these materials on the left here with the stereo extension cable, but I'm going to get to that right after we just briefly see what the toy looks like and also a brief process of adaptation. So here's our toy, and here are two schematics that are actually very helpful for sort of understanding how to adapt the basic battery-operated plush toy. So the top one represents what the toy would look like if you sort of took off the outsides and you just looked at the inside of the toy. You have the battery representing the battery compartment within the toy, and then for most battery-operated plush toys, you're gonna have two wires connecting the battery compartment to the internal switch, and the internal switch would be like the button you would usually click to turn on the toy. So that would represent this here. However, for the toy to be activated with an external switch, of course, we have to introduce a new wire and do a little bit of modifying within the toy. And so it's already actually been done here on the right-hand side. But for the sake of this video, we're going to be adapting the left-hand side here, but we could actually adapt the bottom two as well. And so what I essentially did here, and what I'm going to show you all today, is how I adapted this part. And what you essentially do is you rip open the seam, you work with this wire a little bit, and you work with the inner wires, of course. You do some stripping to get the interior of the wires here, and then you do a little bit of soldering to secure the connection. And so essentially what you did is you broke the circuit apart, and then you brought it back together with the addition of a new wire here, which the switch plugs into. And so now, there are a lot of different ways to adapt toys, but however, I feel like this is the best way because the toy could still be activated in the original way because you have the original two wires still in the same place. However, you could also activate with the external switch, as that also is introduced to the circuit as well. And so this is the process of adaptation. This would represent the what the toy would look like when just on the interior, and this would represent the last step in the process of adaptation. So if you ever get lost at any point during this presentation, just refer to these two schematics and it'll be very helpful. So I'm going to put the toy to the side here for now, and I'm just going to be working with the 6 foot, 3.5 millimeter stereo extension cable, again, male to female. And so first thing, obviously you want to open it and then take off the end here. And so again, we're only gonna be working with the female end. And as I do this, you could actually look at the schematic and see how we're getting closer and closer to the final picture here. All right, so as for how much wire you wanna cut off, it depends on how much, of course, you wanna have coming out of the toy. In this toy here, I cut about 4 inches to start with. So if you wanna have a little bit more wire, you cut a little bit more, a little bit further down. And then if you want to have a little bit less coming out, you would cut a little bit closer to here. So I'll do about the same amount, so 4 inches. Again, you don't need a ruler, but I find it helpful, especially if it's your first time. So 4 inches here, get a wire cutter or scissors, and just completely cut through. You're gonna discard the side with the male end, and you're just gonna be keeping this side. All right, so now that we have that done, we're going to end up stripping 1/2 inch off here. And essentially what we wanna do is we wanna access the wires within here. So you can see the red and yellow wires, they actually are within this wire here, and this black is actually an insulation wire. So to do that, you could either use wire strippers or you could use wire cutters. I find it easier to to just simply cut into the outer casing here, if you can see that closely, so that you can easily access the inner wires. Because if you use the wire stripper, you might strip the wires within here, which you don't necessarily want to do. So again, just use a wire cutter with scissors, just lightly nab the end here, and then you can simply use your fingernails to sort of open it up. So now on this part, we have 3 different wires. And so we're going to be keeping the red and yellow wires, and you can cut the other wire. It might be a black wire for you or a white wire. Whatever color it is, just cut it. We're not going to be using it. Just simply cut it off, discard it. And so now we have this part here. Again, we're getting closer and closer to the final product here. And so now at this point, strip about 1/4 inch off the red and yellow wires. You could do a little bit more if you want to, but I think about 1/4 inch is good. You could use either the wire strippers or your fingernails. For the sake of the wire strippers, I mean, I might as well use them for a little bit since I have them here. There we go. So you essentially just put them in the smallest hole you can, and then you apply pressure and you just pull. So that's what I did here, if you can see that. Now that we have the inner copper wire within the actual insulation tubing there. So we're gonna do the same thing on the other side. For this example, I'll use my fingernail. See, I already did it. With practice, of course, getting your fingernail is a little bit easier to do. So there we go, I have the 2 ends there. So now that I've done that, I'm going to switch cameras and bring in the toy. All right, so now getting a little bit of a closer angle here. You can see the toy here. The reason I changed to a closer angle is because the wires here are actually very small, and we want to make sure we can see everything that's going on. So I have the wire that we just worked on here. We're not going to be using it right now, but as you can see, in a little bit closer detail here, these are the ends of the copper wires, and so they should look like this. So this is what the final product should be before you move on to the toy. So put that to the side now, and now we can actually start working within the toy. So again, we already adapted this part here. So what I did in the beginning is I just inserted the seam ripper in here, and I move down. You open that up, and then you find the 2 inner wires. So we're going to do that same thing on this side. So again, seam rippers here. You can either start down here or go down here, but essentially you just pick a seam, which is, you know, a connection between 2 fabrics, and you're going to try to find 2 wires within the actual toy connecting the switch to the battery compartment within the toy. So I'll start a little bit further up. All right, so that's the little seam I opened up here. And then at this point, you want to try to find the wires within the toy. So you might have to fish around a little bit, but after some time, you should be able to find them. All right, so I think I found one here. And once you find them, just bring them out of the seam. Oh, there's one. Here's the other. And for the universal battery operated plush toy, there's usually going to be, again, 2 wires, like I mentioned in the schematic, connecting the switch to the battery compartment. So here are those 2 wires. Take pretty much as you can out, because again, you want to be working with more wire than less. Now at this point, we're going to bring in the adjustable helping hands tool, which is going to be helpful for holding the 2 wires in place and preventing them from going back into the seam. So I'm just going to grab sort of both ends here with the tool. All right, make sure y'all can see that. So now we have the 2 wires here. And so, although you can't see the schematic, I'll try to bring it in for a second again. Again, this being the finished product. Put it right here. Again, so you're gonna have 2 wires connecting the switch here to the battery compartment within the actual toy. And so what we wanna do now is we actually wanna separate these 2 wires, and then we're gonna strip the ends until we find the copper wires within, just like we did here. And then we're actually gonna be introducing this wire in, and like we did here, we're gonna end up soldering here, and then we're gonna make sure the connection is all secure. So that's what you can look forward to in the next part of this presentation. So now, again, we're going to start with one wire at a time. So you can either pick the top wire or the bottom wire. I'll pick the top one. And you're just gonna cut it down the middle about halfway. All right, so we did that. And now, just like we did previously, you're gonna wanna strip the ends of the wire, exposing the inner copper within, just like that. And so again, you could either use a wire stripper or your fingernail. I'm just gonna use my fingernail. It's a little bit faster. And you wanna strip off about the same amount as you did here, so about 1/4 inch. You could do a little bit more. It's actually a little bit favorable to do a little bit more because we're gonna end up twisting the wires all together. So if you don't have enough wire stripped off, you might have to strip a little bit more a little bit later on. So you can maybe do a little bit more than 1/4 inch. And as you can see here, these individual strands are actually the copper strands. So we're gonna twist them together quickly. You can do this later on, but again, what you wanna do is just expose these inner copper wires. So you do the same thing for the other side now. So that side's done. Now we're gonna do this side. Get about 1/4 inch off. You can do a little more. And then once we finish that, like we are here, we have that done. And now what we're actually gonna do is we're gonna twist these two wires together. And so as you're doing this, just apply pressure and just simply twist it. And then if it's twisted well enough, if you remove your hands, try to separate a little bit with force, the wire shouldn't come apart. And so now at this point, just like again in the schematic, I guess I'll leave it on here, although it may be a little bit difficult to see. We separated the top two wires, and now we're gonna bring the one here in, and then once we have all the wires together, we're gonna solder. So I'll put that to the side again. So it doesn't matter if you use the red or the yellow on the top here. Just use this yellow for this part, and then I'll use the red on the bottom. So again, put a lot of force in twisting these wires together, either in a clockwise or counterclockwise motion. And then once it's well together and you put a little bit of force and nothing comes off, then you're at the point where you can start soldering. So I'm gonna bring in the soldering equipment here. So I have the solder on the left-hand side. Again, this is the wire that we end up melting onto the connection. And then you have the soldering iron here. So you press it together and then melt the wire onto the connection. So this could take a little bit of practice, but essentially what you do is you get as close as you can to the connection. So the connection being the exposed copper wires all twisted together here. And then you're gonna lightly touch the solder to the soldering iron. And then at this point, you wanna make sure you also cover the entire end of the copper wire. So at this part, I only have the outside end, but I wanna try to get to the other end too. So again, just apply a little bit more. You wanna make sure you have it well covered with solder, because that's what's gonna be keeping the connection together. So there we go, we finished that. I'm gonna bring it hopefully a little bit closer. Hopefully y'all can see that. And and again, you can check to see if you did this right. If you pull the ends, again, using a little bit more force now, and nothing should really separate. So that's how you know you have everything in the correct area. And so now that we finished that, you can just repeat for the other side. Cut down the middle. Strip about 1/4 inch off, maybe a little more off the ends here. All right, that should be good enough. Do the same thing for the other side now. Okay, there we go. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time to strip the wires, especially of the toy wires, because it could just be a little bit more difficult. All right, so now that that's done, you can see the copper there. And now, just like we did, instead of using the yellow wire, we're gonna use the red wire. First, we're gonna twist these two together, of course. All right, that should be good. Now we're gonna bring in the red wire here. Again, twist it as much as you physically can until they're all intertwined, because that's how you're gonna have the best connection possible. Okay, so that should be good. Now, just like we did on the top, again, we're gonna solder. Just lightly pressing the solder into the soldering iron right on top of the copper connection, just to coat it. There we go there. Yep, that should be good. So now at this point, you can actually remove the helping hands. Put those to the side, bring it a little bit closer. Now, if we actually look back at the schematic, I'll bring it in here in a second. You could actually see it looks very, very similar to what we did. We have the two wires connecting the switch to the battery compartment. So switch to the battery compartment. These are actually the two wires. And as you can see, after the soldering, it looks very similar. It's actually pretty much identical to the model here. And so that's what you really should be looking for. You reattach the original wires, and then you also brought in this wire that the switch is going to plug into. And so now you have the connection running, you have the current running from the switch to the battery compartment and vice versa, and now also through this cable here. So now it can be activated both ways. And so with that being said, we can actually test the toy.
Can you guess what I am?
So now it does work.
Can you
as you keep clicking it.
Can you guess what I am?
And then I'll turn it off for a second, turn it back on. And then we can actually test it with a switch as well. So we can bring in the switch here. It's a 3D printed switch. Use any switch you have. And just simply plug it into the port here. And then if the switch if you click the switch and it activates, then that's how you know you did the adaptation correctly. So let's test it. There we go. It did work. So that's good. We can turn the toy back off. All right, so there we go. Now at this point, we're actually going to have to seal up these two ends, because if these two ends touch at any point, it'll actually accidentally turn on the toy. So of course you don't want to have the toy activating at random times when these two touch on the inside. This is where we bring in the electrical tape, as I mentioned in the beginning. You know, you could also use other tape like duct tape, but I would recommend electrical tape as it's sort of for this purpose. And then just rip a decent amount off. And what you're going to be using for this is you're going to be coating the two sides of the solder bits with this electrical tape. So start with the top one. And you want to wrap it as tight as you can. Really press it down as you're going along, because you want to make sure this doesn't come loose at any point. So pressing really tight along. And again, we're doing this to make sure the two ends don't connect, because if these two ends connect, it'll accidentally turn on the toy. We do not want that happening. So once you get it completely around, just press down with a lot of force. And now we just repeat that on the other side as well. Let's get about the same length of tape. And we can wrap that around here. Again, pressing with a lot of force as you go along. Okay, so then at the end, I guess, pressing down really hard to make sure the tape doesn't fall off at any point, because if both pieces of tape fall off and these connections touch, the toy will randomly activate. So you don't want that happening. So this tape is very secure now. And now at this point, we end up stitching up the toy. And so I'm not going to show that on camera for the sake of time, but one thing I will show you is that before you end up stitching up the toy, you have to make a little knot here. So just simply go around and loop the sort of the end here through, and then really tighten the knot down here. You don't want to have it going obviously on the wires down here. You still want to have it be knotted on the same original wire. But what you're doing, and I'm going to show a picture here in just a minute, when you're sewing this up, as you go in one direction or the other direction, the most important thing you really have to do is, you see this little hole here, you have to as you're going through the stitching pattern, you want to try to loop the needle and thread through here and connect it to the inside. And so it'll make more sense once I show this picture here. But the reason you're doing this is that if someone pulls on this cable here, it'll actually pull on this knot and the fabric, and it's not going to pull on the connection you made, because if it pulls on the connection you made, obviously it might loosen it, it might break the connection. So obviously you don't want that happening. So you would just go through regularly stitching it up, and then as you reach the knot, just go a couple times through looping it and stitching it to the interior here, and then closing it up. And then that's pretty much what you would have. And that would be your final product. And so that's pretty much it. And thank you for watching.